Hello, hello. Good morning to most, good afternoon to others, and good evening to the viewing audience across the pond. I'm your host, not Jason Miles. Also, not Pascal Robert. I am M. Toussaint, here for another episode of This is Revolution. If you're new to the channel, thank you so much for joining us on this lovely Tuesday night. If you're a returning subscriber, welcome back. So glad to have you all here with us. As many of the patrons know, the last month we launched the Crisis Papers, a bi-weekly series of essays, mainly by Jason Miles. Now these are free to all patrons, and depending on your tier, the magazine formatted version is free as well. But if you're not a patron and would like to support this show and this type of writing, you can purchase the last two issues. The latest issue, The Bizarre Ride to the Far Side, the dystopian reality of disposable people in neoliberalism's hellscape, is up and available now. And MT will be providing a link, that would be me, will be providing a link to here in the chat. And there's also a link to it in the description of this show. I'm going to bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog. Everybody's homie, everybody's dog, Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, M. Toussaint.
How are you this fine night, sir?
The homie, the dog.
That is you.
Just shout out to Sean Combs. Going to be behind bars, man. It's a sad day.
Is.
For all the bad boy fans.
He is the baddest boy of all.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of don't stop, won't stop.
1,000 bottles of baby oil?
Yo.
Do you know anything about that?
What? I know what? I don't know about no freak off.
I feel like we're going to learn a lot about 1,000 bottles of baby oil. Also guns. Let's not forget that.
Big guns.
Firearms were found. Yeah. So let's
the baby oil assassin. Oh my gosh.
All right, let's get into our introduction. In many leftist circles, the term wealth building can trigger skepticism. It often brings to mind the language of neoliberal capitalism, where wealth creation is synonymous with the exploitation of labor and the concentration of resources in the hands of the few. With wealth inequality reaching historic highs, housing costs soaring beyond the reach for many, and environmental devastation rampant due to the unbridled market forces of capital, should we rethink how we approach wealth? The concept of community wealth building offers an alternative rooted in collective ownership and control, challenging the individualist, competitive frameworks of traditional wealth accumulation. Community wealth building seeks to empower workers and communities through cooperative models of enterprise, public ownership, and socially controlled financial institutions. It challenges the logic of capital by redistributing economic power from corporations and financial elites to the people. As Colin Bruce Anthes argues in his article, Canada needs a federal community wealth building agenda for Canadian dimension. This model represents a radical departure from the status quo, positioning economic justice as the foundation of democratic life. In a time when neoliberalism has hollowed out communities and starved them of resources, could community wealth building be a pathway to a more egalitarian and environmentally sustainable future? let's bring in our guest, Colin Bruce Anthes.
Yay!
Yay! Clap, 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 clap.
Hey,
Colin,
folks. Good to
thank
be
you.
back.
Thank you for coming back to the show. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Good to be back. That was a
Appreciate
fantastic intro. Thank you. That was great.
Awesome.
appreciate your writing here. Let me take the first question here. The Marxist critique of wealth building. Traditional discussions of wealth often prioritize individual accumulation and competition. How does community wealth building disrupt this paradigm by centering the needs of the collective? As you highlight in your article, Colin, community wealth building is about dismantling the monopoly of private capital over public resources. How does this connect to a Marxist critique of capital's control over the means of production and distribution?
Yeah, fantastic question. Fantastic question. So, first, if I could go a little bit into the building blocks of community wealth building, kind of frame it for everybody and explain how it works. It is often contrasted with another method of economic development that's very common still today, which is to try and attract outside business into communities by being competitive for their interests. And what that means is effectively bribing them. So we give them huge subsidies, we give them tax breaks, we do huge publicly funded construction projects on their behalf. And then they come with jobs that were previously in another community and simply relocate them and look for an opportunity to take those same resources to get a better bribe somewhere else. And so it doesn't take an expert in game theory to see that this is the race to the bottom dynamic. And that's very, very prominent still to this day. So community wealth building sets itself up as, in contrast to that and as a way out of that by saying we can start with what we already have in place. And we can use that to then build democratic wealth from the ground up for the benefit of the people who actually live and work in that community. Now, there are kind of a couple of key component parts to this. The basic operating principle is that we are looking at the different ways that people in communities can hold sources of wealth in common, and then how those can be used to support each other in a complex. That's the basic operating principle. From there, we build up to 5 core principles. And the 5 core principles are inclusive and democratic forms of ownership, of which we have many. Progressive procurement, that's the big game changer here. Uh, Socially just use of land and property. Locally rooted finance, usually through credit unions and public banks, and then fair work, so living wage employment, as well as safe work conditions, role for unions in there. And we look to put those together to support each other in a complex. So one of the main ways of getting started, the cooperatives for all time have been doing this first element of taking one source of wealth that's held in common and using it to support another. A very, probably the most common example would be the credit union, which is a financial cooperative, and
Mm-hmm.
that has a board of directors elected by its members, and using that lending power and using that sponsorship power to then support other things that people want in the community, often including community nonprofits and other cooperatives. The most radical version of that I know of would be in the Basque region of Spain, where a little micro business worker co-op partnered with a credit union. The credit union gave it continuous lending power, and that built up to the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, which today
Mm-hmm.
has 70,000 workers in 90 federated worker co-ops with tremendous rates of democracy and pay and whatnot, and equality. That is kind of classic community wealth building. But the problem with cooperatives, which has nothing to do with their functionality, cooperatives, research in Quebec says that cooperatives are more than twice as likely to last 10 years or more than standard business. There's nothing wrong with their efficacy. They work just fine. The issue is that they're started at the tiniest fragment of the rate that standard business is started. And they tend to have to start one at a time from scratch. So they build up very slowly, while big money is moving very fast. So it's pretty rare that they actually take up a lot of space on their own in a community's economy. There are some exceptions, and when there are exceptions, the results are fantastic, but they are fairly rare. What community wealth building does is it says, let's start with what's in a community, and let's begin with anchor institutions, because everyone has anchor institutions. Public, nonprofit, quasi-public enterprise. So, and by quasi-public, I mean publicly funded nonprofits, for instance. Let's take a look at these resources and see what they have at their disposal to turn wealth and power back into the hands of the people who live there. One of the things that we don't think about very often with these anchor institutions is that they have a lot of spending power. Every year they are purchasing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods and services. So that's a major source of investment. And we don't think about that very often, and neither do they. Often neither do they. They are often simply purchasing a product that's from a familiar vendor that looks like it's a good product at a cheap price, and they think that that's a good use of taxpayer money or what have you. And what they are doing is buying from companies that are multinational corporations from out of town, with the profits going into the hands of a tiny number of people. And they have an office in Belgium and a bank account in the Cayman Islands. And so effectively, they're taking all that money and throwing it out of the community. Now, what they can be doing is looking for opportunities to take more of that spending, invest it locally, purchase from local enterprises, and prioritize the best economic actors so that we're already incentivizing and accelerating their development. Living wage employers, employee-owned companies, cooperatives, community nonprofits, these things that we are starting on the other side that are usually one-off projects on their own. Then we start to put the wealth into the hands of lots of people who live locally. Now, there's a hard economic logic to this. When we put the wealth into the hands of a lot of people who live locally, they spend a lot more of it locally, so you get economic multipliers. And that in turn also accelerates the development of these employee-owned cooperative and community nonprofit enterprise. So there is an amplifying effect that happens here as a result of this. From there, we build up to these 5 key pillars that can get layered in. Just use of land. Well, if we have more good investment and more good worker-owned jobs and cooperative jobs, that's going to create more prosperity, but that will make the land values go up. And that can cause gentrification. So we also develop a community land trust to create permanent sources of affordable housing. We start to have a land-labor-capital relationship that allows for the good local investment, the good democratic jobs, and the affordable housing in perpetuity. And then we layer in more for that from there. So that's the basic functioning of community wealth building. Now, to get back to the Marxist critique of capital. First off, the distribution of the wealth and the distribution of the surplus, right? Completely different. To give a sense of the scale of how much inclusive and democratic ownership changes the way wealth is distributed, the way it is accumulated, and the way it is circulated. In 2021, there was a paper that came out from not exactly a left-wing radical institution, the Harvard Business Review. They looked at what would happen if just 30% of American companies were at least 30% employee-owned, based on the existing companies that are 30 to 100% employee-owned. What they found was that the wealth of the bottom 50% of the population from this, what would seem to be a fairly minor reform, would quadruple. Black American wealth would octuple. Latinx American wealth would increase 12-fold. There would be gains for the bottom 90% of the population, no loss for the bottom 99% of the population. The only loss is coming, I think, a 12 to 14% loss from the top 1%. So in terms of the distribution of the resources, the wealth, the surplus, completely different pattern of distribution, of accumulation, and of circulation. That's just the level. That's just talking about the dollars at that point. But we're also shifting decision making more locally, and we're doing something else here. Now, 2 of the big champions of community wealth building are Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, who are epidemiologists, public health experts. And they produced a couple of books, The Spirit Level and The Inner Level, that looked at, they demonstrated pretty convincingly that more equal societies fare better than their comparators at virtually everything. And that the equality was not a result of more successful societies, it was a causal independent variable. In other words, people were doing better in health, life expectancy, education, happiness, well-being, lack of negative externalities, less toxic waste in the water, so on and so forth. They were functioning better at every level when they were more equal. And the reason was that as we begin to have more unfairly unequal divisions in our society, we start to have more breaking down of social connections, in-groups and out-groups, myths to try and justify that level of inequality. Trust goes down, social anxiety goes up, That causes major health problems, increases of depression, suicide, and our ability to solve problems go way down. And in fact, we saw that some of the best countries had overlap in their results with societies that weren't even industrial in some cases, because the Pennsylvania Amish were doing fine. It was the people in New York and London that we had to worry about. And so, what community wealth building is doing is we can see from there that we can't address wealth in any sense until we get to who controls the resources. We have to be paying attention to that. And Wilkinson and Pickett are very specific about that. But we can see that wealth isn't just dollars at the same time. It's also trust. It's also the ability to problem solve together, to know that we have confidence that we are not going to have toxic waste in our water. It is elements of what Marx was looking at early in his career, where he discussed alienated labor as both an economic condition and also a personal condition, that we had less personal meaning and ability to connect to others. And community wealth building, in incorporating these different ways of being able to hold wealth in common, bringing the decision making closer to home, and being able to create a more equal society and democratic society from the ground up, is speaking to both those elements of alienation and offering some practical solutions for making big progress on both sides.
You know, I appreciate the kind of ideological, uh, should I say, halcyon kind of narrative of these left philosophies to try to change the economy. But there's a concept that we have called proof of concept, where
Yeah.
we like to look at like actual models
Yeah.
that worked and how they can be implemented. What kind of proof of concept do we have that we could take something like this and put it to scale where it can work in a place like the United States?
Yeah, fantastic. Great question. And I apologize if I took a long time to answer that first question, because I sort of
No,
needed to
take your
get a little
time.
bit into the model. Great. So first off, it begins in Cleveland. In Cleveland, what they began with was getting anchor. They had a vicious tale of two cities. History there, first of racist redlining, and then deindustrialization, including major population loss. Result of that was they had one neighborhood that was quite affluent, a few major anchor institutions, hospital, clinic, some nice houses, things like that around there. And then another neighborhood right next to it with 40,000 people, with a median household income of $18,000. Extraordinary poverty, huge unemployment, and people in pretty dire straits. So they were trying to figure out how they could get some of the money to flow into that other part of the community. First thing they did was, with an intervention from the Cleveland Foundation, often gets started by different people, in this case, a community nonprofit. They brought some anchor institutions together to sign on to a mantra of buy local, hire local, live local, get more money circulating locally. And then starting in 2008, they began to build up, they created a community nonprofit with help from a group called the Democracy Collaborative that would start 3 worker cooperatives. So community-owned, neighborhood-owned nonprofit that started 3 worker cooperatives, eco-friendly worker cooperatives, employing people from this underprivileged neighborhood, and then would continue to own 5 to 20% of the shares of each of those worker co-ops, so that if they were successful, some of the money would come back, they could reinvest in the network, but do so with community input. So there were independent businesses, but never totally losing track of community control and community influence. The evergreen cooperatives built up from, the first few were rolled out between 2008 and 2011-12, I believe. And then they built up to about 90 employees by 2015. And then they started to really get hold of some of that procurement coming from the anchor institutions. From 2015 to 2021, they built up to about 400 employees, or 350 employees, making 25% above industry averages. And then they started to add another layer to this, which was they created a fund for employee ownership. And this is a contemporary issue. What they noticed was that they started building based on Mondragon. Something's very different from when Mondragon builds. Today we have what's called sardonically the silver tsunami of retiring entrepreneurs. So the silver tsunami of entrepreneurs is that we have in Canada $2 trillion worth of companies that are changing hands in the next decade because of retirement. And almost none of them have any succession plans. And they went, we should be trying to convert these businesses, community stable, successful companies with workers who are going to lose their jobs. We should be turning these into worker cooperatives. So they created a fund for employee ownership. and have since then helped convert another 5 businesses, existing businesses in Cleveland, into worker co-ops by helping their workers purchase those companies, take them under worker control. Now, while this was happening, another city called Preston in England saw what was happening. They were in desperate condition, worst in the country. Saw what was happening in Cleveland, went, we want to do a version of that here, but we want to do it citywide, and we want to do it way larger looking at procurement. They went from doing 30% of their procurement in the local region to 80%. So completely transformed it, including taking public pension funds and investing it locally while developing cooperatives, housing cooperatives, worker cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, and the first community land trust in the area. So they they started doing this in 2011-12. In 2018, they were named the most improved city in the United Kingdom. And since then, they've been named the best place to raise a family in the United Kingdom, among other accolades, best place in the northwest of England to live. They've won this series of awards, which has led to another explosion of this practice. Importantly, one of the things that was found in Preston was that when they were saying they were going to go all in with this progressive use of procurement, the critics said, you're going to bankrupt the city. You're going to get terrible products at a very high price. It breaks all the principles of neoliberal development, right? And they found that, in fact, there was so much more viable activity happening in the area that when it came time to collect taxes, they had the ability to make public investments in public housing, in public arts and culture institutions, quality of life elements, publicly owned cinema, that they had not been able to make in generations. So they found it was exactly the reverse. This was a much better way of creating a virtuous cycle of democratic wealth building in the community. Since then, community wealth building has spread to, there have been initiatives in cities, small towns, mid-sized cities, indigenous communities all around the world, including Chicago, Amsterdam, Sydney. I can go into some of those. One of the big developments that's happened recently, and it's kind of important to clock just how much growth of community wealth building there has been in 19 years as we look for what might be some of the leading ways that we could move beyond neoliberalism, because it's starting to get to that kind of scale where we can talk about that. In Scotland, the government first looked at community wealth building, funded some pilot projects, and then adopted community wealth building as core methodology towards their well-being and just transition agendas, appointed a minister of community wealth, and created centralized resources to get community wealth building at least rolling in every county across the entire country. So we are starting to see a feedback loop, which comes with a different relationship to government, in which things that have powerful demonstrations at the local level create resources at larger levels of government, but not with the larger levels of government taking over the local, with the larger levels of government creating the kinds of facilitatory resources that allow this methodology to be implemented and spread in many, many places. So a ripple effect across a country. And that's where the potential for another really big wave of growth based on these really powerful demonstrations. It's been growing because of those powerful demonstrations. The proof of concept is very strong. But we are now seeing that level where there is room for an explosion of growth of this activity from where it is now.
So you want to ask the next question?
I do, but first I want to have a look at this comment. Someone said, sounds all very nice, but meaningless without addressing state power.
100%. Yeah.
So let's talk about state power. Let me get the question.
Completely.
You argue for a federal agenda in Canada to support community wealth building.
Mm-hmm.
How does this align with the Marxist understanding of the state's role?
Yeah.
Should we look to the state as an instrument of class rule that can also be reformed to redistribute wealth? Or is there an inherent tension in expecting the capitalist state to dismantle the systems that uphold it? Or would a little social democracy go a long way in trying to alleviate much of the inequality we're witnessing?
Yeah. Can you reread those last 2 points? Because I think there's sort of two sections there. I want to make sure I address them both.
Sure. Should we look to the state as an instrument of class rule that can also be reformed to redistribute wealth?
Hmm.
Or is there an inherent tension in expecting the capitalist state to dismantle the systems that uphold it?
Yeah, yeah, great. Um,
Mhm.
so, and then you said about social democracy. Would a little social democracy go a long way?
Right, right.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things about that. First off, when we talk about states today,
Hmm.
uh, they're in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom. We have a huge challenge. We have states today are much more varied in what that term means
Hmm.
than it used to be. We have something like 200 nation states. Some of them have universal suffrage, proportional representation, 80+% voter turnout, and you can kind of demand a lot more in those circumstances than what we see in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom. We have first past the post electoral politics. We have uh, high levels of inequality. So that means you have concentrated electoral interests and
Hmm.
concentrated economic interests. And in the mid 20th century, these institutions were more responsive to the working class. There was a little bit more working class voice in our democratic systems, and that has really declined. And I don't have all of the answers to that. I'm not going to pretend that I have all of the answers to that. What I can say is that powerful demonstrations at the local level do have ability to permeate higher levels of government sometimes. And there is, and so there is, it's not to say that it's a surefire recipe. I don't want to overstate this. There's a
Hmm.
huge challenge here, no question. I can't solve it in two minutes. But one of the things that community wealth building does, two things that community wealth building does. The first is it reduces the perceived dependence upon big money. And one of the problems that we have right now is there is an institutionalized kind of consistency that we see from a lot of local levels of government, state or provincial levels of government, and national levels of government, where there is this perception that we need the big players and we need to suck up to them. That's still very prevalent. One
Hmm.
of the things that community wealth building does is it creates an alternative locally. It creates a demonstration locally that shows that is not the case, that sometimes is able to ripple up. And so there is a way of chipping away here that could have larger impact. And we have seen some of that even in the United States. Now, the main champion for community wealth building in American politics was Jamal Bowman, who's recently been taken down, but he actually was able to get employee ownership as a procurement priority in the CHIPS and Science Act. And that was based on local demonstrations in places like Chicago, New York, developing the Worker Cooperative Business Development Initiative, and various others, Cleveland, various others across America, Rochester, another one. So there is the ability to undermine some of that relationship from local demonstrations. With that said, I again don't want to make it sound like this is easy. It absolutely is not. And in
Hmm.
some places, it is certainly far more possible than others. And I have to say, in Canada, we're in a bit of a rush to see if we can get anything because we have a center rightish government. Really, Trudeau is, if you're on Twitter, he's a communist, but if you're in Canada, and you're in reality, he's a center right wing politician. And he's
Right.
probably about to get wiped out by a radical right wing politician, in which case I suspect all doors at larger levels of government will be shut. So I'm doing the best I can from in my political organizing capacity to see what I can do. But
Hmm.
rest assured, I'm not naive about how challenging that is. So uh, however, there was another question there, which was not just about how fucked up is Canada or the United States. It was about what should the appropriate role of the state be. And I
Right.
think that what we see here is, I hope I didn't take too long and
No, you're good.
this. Okay,
Mhm.
um, I think what we see here is an appropriate use of when we see community wealth building recognized by larger levels of government, we see a pretty appropriate use for government in the 21st century, which we have to, I think, rethink a little bit. Kind of major roles for government are typically allocation, regulation, and redistribution. We tend to focus redistribution on redistribution of wealth after it's been produced, which was sort of alluded to in the um, introduction there, that
Mhm.
we have this idea that wealth building in a neoliberal way we can just have this huge amount of wealth that will solve all of our problems, and that has absolutely not happened. We can also talk about redistributing capital. We can talk about redistributing capital as cooperative capital, as community capital. A lot of the things that local democratic economics need to thrive are actually not rocket science. They are
Mhm.
things like publicity of the model, uh, educational and technical assistance resources, access to seed capital and loans. It isn't rocket science. And when you look at the places where this has absolutely taken off, it's basic stuff that makes this stuff happen. It is not rocket science. The enterprises work just fine. We are good at managing our own affairs.
Mhm.
We There is a buy-in for larger levels of government here because it isn't rocket science and because it actually makes their jobs easier. It makes their jobs easier to demonstrate results and to not have to do everything themselves. Not that they are doing everything themselves, but not to be constantly berated to do everything themselves, to actually hand power back to the people in very concrete ways. It isn't rocket science for them to do this. So there is potentially a buy-in for larger levels of government to do this. In terms of social democracy, community wealth building is not dependent upon social democracy and absolutely can harness social democratic resources to use
Mhm.
those institutions, the procurement purchasing power of social democratic institutions to democratize the rest of the economy. And I think this is potentially, we might get to this a little later on, so maybe I should wrap up very quickly. But I think we need to look at where a bridge can be built between people who are on the democratic socialist end of the spectrum who want to change the fundamental layer of the economy, and the social democratic side that's more interested in compromise, inclusive growth, this kind of thing.
Mhm.
What Very few people who are on that inclusive growth side of the spectrum are actually opposed to things like worker-owned companies and cooperatives and community nonprofits. So there's a bridge here that can be built between those two camps, I think, that represent, depending on where you are, in a lot of major nations, somewhere between 40 and 70% of the electorate. So suddenly we've actually got potentially the ability to piece together something like a way out of corporate capitalism. um, I can go further into that a little bit, but I'm taking up too much time. So I'll bring the questions
No,
back.
not at all. You're the guest. That's why we have you here. To take your time. But let me go to the next question. Colin, you point to worker cooperatives, municipally owned enterprises, and community controlled finances as essential pillars of community wealth building.
Yeah.
How can these structures serve as counter hegemonic forces against corporate power? And how do they challenge capitalist notions of ownership and monopoly power?
Okay. So one caveat first, which is that quite often these initiatives pop up as one-offs that do not seem to have an overarching uh, economic development method that they are attached to, and they can sometimes simply be viewed as something that fills a gap in a community. Sometimes they get pigeonholed a little bit as something that fills an economic gap or a cultural gap or what have you. And so I think it's important to think about what is a practical next step to show implications for growth and for other people to collaborate with what they're doing and start piecing things together. Now, with that said, a part of the reason community wealth building has been able to grow so rapidly is because pretty well everywhere, someone is working on some component part of it, developing a community land trust, building up a credit union, starting worker co-ops or employee ownership centers to start multiple worker-owned companies and cooperatives, so on and so forth, community development investment funds, etc., housing co-ops. And so it takes about 5 minutes to integrate this larger overarching framework. So when you have something up and running and then you take that community wealth building framework, it becomes actually kind of easy, even sometimes creative and fun, to start piecing together where that connects to other things that are happening and can happen in the community. So I think that we need to, as often as possible, when we see people doing a piece of community wealth building who might not know about the overarching framework of community wealth building, bring that into the conversation so that there are immediate implications for taking up space in that community's economy. Also, these demonstrations have a very high rate of success, and that has been the foundation of a lot of things that have happened subsequently. So there are, for instance, um, because worker cooperatives had demonstrated themselves in very sparse numbers in the United States. In 2014, in New York, some progressive activists lobbied the city council to create a worker cooperative business development initiative. Terrible title, doesn't roll off the tip of the tongue very well, but they got institutional support to create this thing. There were 23 worker co-ops in New York when they started. Over the next 7 years, with fairly straightforward minimal resources, they created 133 new ones. And then they did studies on which of the first cohorts were crossing the 5-year mark. And most businesses do not cross the 5-year mark. It's a very low survival rate usually to cross the 5-year mark. Found
Right.
70% of them were crossing the 5-year mark. So really high rates of success. So they had quadrupled the number of worker cooperatives in New York City in 7 years. So it's very important that people, wherever it's possible to start something and get that proof of concept that Pascal was talking about, it's important to do that because, yes, we can absolutely build on that and we can turn that into something that is way more significant. But then I think as rapidly as possible, we need to get that community wealth building framework in there so that the connection to other institutions and to other resources and to other possibilities that can be democratized immediately start to take place.
Tucson, you want to take the next question?
Yes. So it's like a little ecosystem that needs to be built around.
Precisely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for this to work. Okay. What was it? Community wealth building advocates for local control and decentralized economic power. How does this idea of decentralization align with Marxist calls for workers to have direct control over production?
Mm.
As you write, Colin, empowering communities to control their own resources is a direct challenge to the top-down extractive nature of capitalism.
Mhm.
Could this form of local control coexist with the broader socialist agenda for nationalization?
Mhm. Yeah,
There's two
absolutely.
questions in there.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So, a couple of things. First off, community wealth building does say that we need to make more decisions closer to home. So there is it isn't just focused on the big uh, uh, the big nationalized industries. It
Mhm,
is looking at being able to make decisions closer to home, but that doesn't mean that it's mutually exclusive with nationalization agendas either.
mhm,
What there are a wide range of ways, and this comes out of Gar Alperovitz's work beforehand. Gar Alperovitz theorized about a pluralist commonwealth, and he goes on to co-found the Democracy Collaborative, which becomes the primary architects of community wealth building. And as Gar Alperovitz is going through what he calls a pluralist commonwealth, he says the building blocks are things that we already see around us. So we already see uh, big worker-owned companies, small worker-owned companies, very, very successful worker cooperatives, democratic worker control. We already see credit unions control over $1 trillion of finance in America. Virtually every farmer in America belongs to at least one farming co-op. Producer co-ops include, I think, sun-kissed oranges, ocean spray, cranberries. The Associated Press is actually a producer cooperative. Um,
mm,
we see community land trusts and then public utilities and then leveling up to things like social security. So what we see when we piece all of this together is stuff that's rural, stuff that's urban, stuff that puts things on markets, stuff that takes things off markets, stuff that
mhm,
is small scale, stuff that is large scale. We actually have a Swiss Army knife approach to being able to hold wealth in common, that all of these component parts are actually working already better than top down models as
mhm.
enterprises, before we even get to the distribution of wealth and democratic rights and freedoms, which are obviously far more substantial. So, that is to say that we look for the areas in which more conventional public ownership is going to be most practical, is going to be most applicable. And sometimes we do have to talk about things at a very large scale. One example, And this is one that Gar Alperovitz, he's almost 90, but he's still around and he's still doing some really good work. And he
Mhm.
reminds people all the time that we need to keep this in the back of our mind. In 2008, the government had to temporarily nationalize the automotive sector. Right?
Mhm.
Now, what we did then was, when I say we, I mean, I'm Canadian, so it's technically you, but we actually threw some money at it too. Uh,
Mhm.
we bailed out the automotive sector and put the capitalists back. But there was an opportunity there to create high speed rail, public transit, things that we need in this climate change moment of ours,
Mhm.
and to take the things that weren't going to be under government control and turn them into worker owned companies and attach them to that procurement chain and attach them to these public projects. And there was actually a model sitting there that could have been used to remake the American manufacturing sector. Um, and there probably will be another crash at some point, right? So we
Yes.
got to be ready for those kinds of really, really large scale, really large scale moments that require us to hit the ground running. And we do have to look at these models as things that offer solutions at the largest scale in those sudden moments as well. But in the meantime, they are things that we can continue to build up from the local level. And there are benefits to keeping that decision making as local as possible as well.
Hmm. Pascal.
So, Colin, you mentioned in your article that community wealth building is not only a solution to economic injustice, but also an essential part of tackling environmental crises.
Mhm.
How does the community wealth building model address the ecological destruction inherent in capitalist systems of production?
Yeah.
Can local worker owned enterprises be more sustainable alternative to corporate driven environmental degradation?
Awesome question. Awesome question. Yes, 100%. And in fact, I should mention, community wealth building has been advocated by some fairly big names. I mentioned Wilkinson and Pickett. Grace Blakely, the author of Vulture Capitalism, another big advocate of
Mhm.
it, and Kate Rayworth, who is the author of Donut Economics, which is the ecological economics book that kind of took the world by storm about 7 years ago. She's a huge advocate of community wealth building, and she actually outlines some of the ways in which it addresses the climate emergency. First off, um, living wages in place, as opposed to that neoliberal idea, or even sometimes social democratic idea, of creating a huge amount of fairly random economic growth that can be very destructive, and then trying to patch up the problems with redistribution of wealth. Much more efficient, ecologically efficient, to give people in the places in which they live living wage jobs right there. And community wealth building offers a way of doing that through putting the resources into employee-owned companies, cooperatives, living wage employers through our procurement. We have the ability to do that very, very quickly and to develop the models that produce that most commonly. Then we're shortening unnecessarily long supply chains, right? We don't have these huge supply chains that sprawl just because it's convenient for people who have an office in Belgium and a bank account in the Cayman Islands. We're shortening supply chains that reduces carbon emissions inherently. Then there's the additional kind of action that we can take through these models and worker co-ops, yes, for sure. Um, and the evergreen cooperatives, I should mention, I mentioned them earlier from the Cleveland model of community wealth building. We were talking about proof of concept. They were all using eco-friendly technology. So they were, from the beginning, a part of that kind of total system change model. Um, when we bring decisions closer to home, have this plurality of ways of holding wealth in common that include public and community forms of ownership, so that people who are not necessarily conventional workers, last question was about worker control. We
Mhm.
also have a lot of people who have disabilities, are unpaid caregivers, are retirees, but need to be brought into the democratic process of how their communities are developed. And when they're not, what we see immediately are negative externalities like toxic waste in the river because it was convenient for some corporation to dump it there. So that's another thing that reduces carbon emissions and reduces pollution. And then on top of that, we're getting rid of throwaway cities. So I spent last decade in a city called St. Catharines, Ontario. If people look up St. Catharines GM plant, they will immediately see a picture of this deserted factory, abandoned wasteland that's been sitting in the middle of the city for a decade. And what's happening, these throwaway cities are where we all know them, right? A big manufacturing employer that suddenly disappears to Mexico or where have you. And what they're doing is they're building the whole fucking thing in a different place. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, think about just how destructive that is. It's astronomical. We're getting rid of that. We are anchoring our resources locally through this methodology so that they do not just throw our cities away and then go do ecological destruction over there. The last thing is this. Um, I'm mostly, obviously, on the This Is Revolution podcast, I'm going to look at this through the radical left lens.
Mm-hmm.
But some of these methods, I should mention, there was a survey in 2019 that asked 1,500 Americans, what would you rather work for? A company owned by the state, a company owned by outside investors, or a worker-owned company? Now, only 9% said the state. 19% said a company owned by outside investors. 72% said they would rather work for a company owned by its workers. 72%, including 74% of Democrats, 72% of Republicans, 67% of independents, a clear majority of black, white, male, and female participants, more than 75% of people who voted for Clinton, and more than 75% of people who voted for Trump. Okay, that's how popular uh, local worker control and worker ownership of enterprises. It's that kind of popular. Same thing is true for various kinds of cooperatives. If I can give another case study proof of concept, apologize if I'm taking too long because I want to make this really concrete for people if I possibly can.
Take
No,
your
you're
time.
doing good. Mm-hmm.
In Denmark, there's this little island called Samso. Samso is they describe themselves as a conservative farming community, had no interest in economic justice, had no interest in environmental justice. But there were some people who were environmental activists there and who thought this is a perfect place for wind turbines. Now, wind turbines in the conservative community are an immediate no-go. What they did was they said, we'll pilot this with a couple of turbines that are cooperatives. And that means that if you can see it from your backyard, you'll be able to get a piece of it and get some of the economic returns. Passed almost unanimously. From there, they built another 19 turbines under various ownership. A few were local private, but many cooperative and some public ownership as well. Produced enough renewable energy for 20,000 people, 5 times their population, exported to the mainland, equitable distribution of profits across the island, revitalized the local economy, created a bunch of democratic green jobs in the economy, and they now have a negative 12-ton per capita carbon emission rating, which makes them outside of maybe some traditional indigenous tribes in particular places, otherwise maybe the most ecologically friendly economy on Earth, and didn't really have an intention of doing that. It was the cooperative model that brought people together to make that action seem very logical and make sense. And people could immediately see this actually really works to help us build very equitable democratic wealth among a tight-knit community. And suddenly they were all in favor of it. So there is methodology here that can bring some strange bedfellows together and create, a surprisingly large coalition to get really progressive things done, really left-wing things done that really push corporate capital out of the conversation. So I hope that was useful.
How exactly do we plan to? How can we implement these types of ideas and confront the resistance that we're going to get from places like media and capital that are already saturated with capitalist ideological superstructure, and make them irrelevant in terms of our opportunities to implement these types of notions?
Yeah, yeah. This is a huge question. So first off, what I will say is this, and it kind of speaks. My last answer, I think, spoke to it a little bit. I have a lot of faith in people's ability to, when they see this stuff in action, when they see a structure that is not a division of workers and owners, in which workers are organized from above to labor for the profits of the owners. When they see a structure that is not that and is functioning well, it makes the former structure look a little strange, right? I have a lot of belief in people's capacity to understand that, and I think there are a lot of examples of people understanding that model, when presented with the alternatives, of which we have several related ones, when presented with those alternatives, they get it. So I have a lot of faith in the intelligence of ordinary working class people to be able to get this stuff. Getting the message to them is a little bit difficult. You're right, totally, about the problems with corporate media. Um, the Guardian, to their credit, has covered the progress in Preston very, very well. The Guardian has actually done a
Mm.
great job on that. Otherwise, mainstream media has basically, I don't know of any mainstream media that's covered it over here. And it's kind of amazing that community wealth building has been able to spread as well as it has thus far. I do a lot of political organizing around this. And actually, I was thinking about this. I recently was watching the episode that with the filmmaker Alex Cox that you guys did, and I
Mhm.
was thinking about Repo Man, because Repo Man is a film that, like, if there are two parties on the same street and you walk into one, there are a lot of people who have seen it, and if you walk into the other, there's nobody there who's seen it. And that's kind of what community wealth building is like. It's sort of very famous among very concentrated populations, and then siloed, right?
Mhm.
And so this
Mhm.
stuff, the operations of this stuff are not rocket science. Anybody can kind of understand it once they get some examples of it in action, see some things that are probably in their community that are already doing stuff like this. It can spread very easily, but unsiloing it so that stuff that's happening really rigorously in one community doesn't have one that's in the same municipality that is totally oblivious. That's the big challenge. And you know, I think that we probably have to turn to good old fashioned working class organizing to make sure that people are getting the memo and the word is getting around. Because to be honest, I don't see evidence that the mainstream media is going to pick it up at all. I don't see evidence that it's going to get that kind of coverage. I write about it, but I write about it in left wing, you know, of course, and through left wing outlets, and they don't have that the same size of megaphone. So I do the best that I can to get the word out to the public while working on it on the ground floor as well. But yeah, it's a huge challenge, and I think that it's going to require the working class to spread the conversation and make sure that that is happening and it's not getting siloed. Because I don't think that the mainstream media is going to be our friend in this.
Tucson, you want to take that last question?
Sure. Let me hop over. While the article focuses on Canada, community wealth building as a model could have global implications.
Yeah.
How can we frame this as part of a larger international socialist project? What lessons can be drawn from similar movements around the world, and how can they be adapted to a more globalized struggle against capitalism?
Yeah. Fantastic question. I should point out that both Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn had strong community wealth building aspects to their agendas in from 2015 to 2020, um, and so there has been some that sort of flew under the radar a little bit. But Preston was sometimes referred to as the lab for Corbynomics,
Mm,
and Jeremy Corbyn had, among other things, agenda items to first off democratize public enterprise further, make it more participatory, and to double the size of the cooperative sector. Bernie Sanders had an agenda of having a $500 million investment bank to help workers purchase their companies and turn them into worker cooperatives. So, and Bernie Sanders previously was actually way back when he was mayor of Burlington. He created the first municipally funded community land trust in the world, which now has 3,000 housing units on it. So, you know, some of the major figures that we have had in recent years have already started to put some of this stuff together. I think that we need to have um, a. I think that we need to have community wealth building put into the agendas of um, not just people who are running for particular countries. I think that you're totally right. We have to talk about coordination across countries. And one of the exciting things that's happened with community wealth building is it started to do that right out of the gates. It began in Cleveland, but was immediately taken over to a place in England. Neil McEnroy, who is the global lead for community wealth building with the Democracy Collaborative, was a big part of that. And it's actually spread probably further in European countries. then it has, I shouldn't say further than in the United States, but it's hard to say. There's a lot of activity happening globally with
Mhm.
community wealth building. And so one of the exciting things that has happened is there is a foot in the door all around the world now. So the question is, as we look at what's happening with Scotland, where it's getting really prevalently onto the national agenda, can we use that as a way of amplifying that kind of agenda everywhere? Can that become something that we expect of our progressive political candidates in every country? We do have a seed planted in all of these different places. It is possible to piece all of that together. And again, it isn't necessarily rocket science to figure out how to do it, but it is a big organizing challenge. So it's a fantastic question. There's a real opportunity there for a different for this to be the foundation of a different global system. Absolutely. Um, but yeah, there is still a big organizing hurdle, and without mainstream media coverage, as Pascal was bringing up before, it really is up to us to make the demand of that. So it's going to come from working class organizing if we get that kind of global system change approach.
All right. Well, we're coming up on an hour. Tucson, do you have any other questions?
I do. I just have a couple from the chat.
Great, great.
And hopefully we can illuminate some things for people. You mentioned Mondragon,
Mhm.
which is in Spain, Richard Wolff's favorite place.
Yeah.
So Cleveland came before Mondragon.
Pardon, can you say that again?
The community wealth building came in Cleveland before Mondragon.
No, no.
Okay.
Mondragon came first by a
Mhm.
considerable margin and was an influence on the Cleveland model. But
Mhm.
Mondragon built up as a worker cooperative federation with partnership with, they built up with a credit union. That was the
Mhm.
financial resource that allowed them to continuously expand because they had the lending power of that credit
Mhm.
union. Started with very small micro business and built up to 70,000 workers today in 90 federated worker co-ops. Community wealth building borrowed from that, but started with a community owned nonprofit and then combined that with the purchasing power of local anchor institutions to start to scale the evergreen cooperatives up at a rate that we haven't seen worker co ops scale in America outside of maybe Cooperative Home Care Associates in the Bronx, New York. I think it's the only other one that has scaled the way the evergreen cooperatives have. So they were using new tools to do a spin on the Mondragon cooperatives that allowed
Mhm.
for the kind of growth of worker cooperatives in the United States that we haven't previously seen.
Have you ever been to Mondragon?
Me?
Yeah.
No, no.
No.
I would love to go, but I have not had a chance to go myself.
That sounds like an excellent lefty vacation.
Yeah, for sure.
They do classes and stuff too. It's pretty cool.
Yes, they do. Yeah, yeah, and they're really good. Actually, they helped with the advising on the evergreen cooperatives, and they do a lot of that. They really do have solidarity with the worker co-op movement and the cooperative movement around the world. So
Hmm.
yeah, they're a fantastic institution for sure.
Awesome. I'm not entirely sure what this question means, but
Mm.
I'll ask it and see if you can address it. How are these cooperatives and community wealth build associations utilizing the knowledge economy?
Oh wow, that's a fantastic question. I'm terribly sorry. I don't think I'm prepared to answer it. I
Mm.
don't think I know enough about the knowledge economy to connect those dots for you. So
Okay.
I'm sorry. I will. If you send in an email address, I'll do some research and I'll get back to you. But unfortunately, I can't answer that one off the top of my head.
Cool. This person asks, any hope for New Mexico?
And you hope for New Mexico. Of course, it can. There's hope everywhere, but I do not know enough about the New Mexico economy to suggest where a start might begin. But
Sure.
yes, this methodology, and actually, if I could sort of harken back to the very first question,
Hmm.
which was, and I was talking a little bit about alienation there, but one of the nice things about community wealth building is that this actually can be used in a great variety of settings and accounts for regional difference. It gives room for creativity, gives room for cultural expression to be included in community wealth building. So yes, we can see community wealth building used to bring out very different flavors and very different colors of different places. I don't know what it would look like in New Mexico, but I'd love to find out.
Ooh, that would be very cool. Uh, Cleveland Rocks, great name for today's show, is wondering what are examples of community capital?
Oh yeah, fantastic. Great question. So um, one example would be in Scotland. They have what's called the Scottish Land Fund. Well, the
Hmm.
Scottish Land Fund, it's funded by the British Lottery, like a lot of things, a lot of British films and whatnot. It's and what it is, it's a granting program, very very simple. That it is to give community land trusts and community organizations grants to purchase land and property, uh, and every year they can apply for funding and then just purchase these and take them under community control. And so they also have a law in Scotland that says that community organizations can yeah, vacation. Community organizations can, if there's a piece of property that they want to purchase, should it come up for sale, they
Hmm.
actually get to make a sort of reservation on it, so that if it comes up for sale, they get first dibs on it. And then they can often use the grant funding from the Scottish Land Fund to then purchase that property and take it under community ownership. And there have been hundreds of purchases taking properties under community ownership through that. To get into community capital and cooperative capital, something that happened in Chicago when the American Rescue Plan was released. $15 million of that was taken by the city of Chicago and put into a community wealth building pilot project. What they did was they gave it 3 phases. The first one was outreach and building educational resources, then using those educational resources to develop projects, and then making those projects eligible for grant funding on the other side to get them out of the gate. And they used that to develop worker cooperatives, community land trusts, community development investment funds, and housing cooperatives. So that really clear example of taking some money, using that to train up these different elements of a system
Hmm.
with democratic forms of ownership, and then with education, technical assistance, and seed capital, being able to get those hitting the ground running. So those are some examples of community capital and cooperative capital, being able to make this stuff happen at a faster rate, larger scale, so on and so forth.
Nice. Our illustrious mod, Sune, says, I've seen firsthand how beneficial this community wealth building has been in rural China.
Oh wow, wow, amazing. I would actually love to know about that. I don't know about the community wealth building work in rural China. That's really really interesting. I would love it if that could be, if a link could be sent my way. I'd love to look into that. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds very interesting to me too. Another person says, I can imagine access to capital, banking, credit unions being organized locally in this way, better terms and rates for the consumer. So this is sort of already happening with credit unions. Yeah.
Absolutely. So if I could just add to that, and it's really we should, we should be pushing people to get into the credit unions, but also the other thing is to make sure they're voting in the company elections. That's a really
Mm,
big thing, because sometimes a lot of people just join a credit union because they think it's a local bank, and they would
mhm,
rather have something local than some big corporate brand that is probably up to its eyeballs in fraud, which is fair enough. And that actually is a very good reason to go to a credit union. And you're right, better rates, and I mean, there isn't the same amount of crazy stuff in the fine print, because you'd be
mm,
ripping yourself off if you were to put crazy scams in the fine print. But sometimes, as a result, the credit unions are not as active. They're just there to kind of take care of basic financial things, and they're not necessarily looking for ways to really break out into their community and do really and be very active. And then others are very participatory and extremely active in looking for those opportunities. I belong to an extremely progressive credit union called Vancity in Vancouver, and Vancity has helped create housing cooperatives, community land trusts, various other kinds of cooperatives, worker co-ops, about 5,000 units of affordable housing in Vancouver. So and it actually sponsors a lot of the publicity of these models as well. So
Mhm.
yes, the credit unions can be a massive force for change, but we need to vote in the elections and make sure they're participatory. So join them, but also make sure you're active in them because they can just sit there sometimes.
That's a great point. We've got another question from Cleveland. Wouldn't there be an inherent problem in having a socialist, democratic, community owned business operating in a competitive, capitalist oriented market economy? Well, you
Yeah.
may have answered this already because this is an older question, but I
Okay.
don't
Yeah.
know if you'd like to just address it really quickly.
It is a fantastic, fantastic question, and this is why we need to have, um, and this kind of goes out of we didn't talk about this too much, but I mentioned Gar Alperovitz earlier.
Hmm.
There is,
He's an
and I
economist.
sort of, pardon?
He's an economist and historian,
Yes, an
in case
economist and
anyone wants to
historian.
look him up. Hmm.
A very storied history, really interesting guy. Helped smuggle the Pentagon Papers to the press with Daniel Ellsberg and begin the end of the Vietnam War, among other things. And
Wow.
really interesting figure. Um, he his uh, pluralist Commonwealth, and I wanted to do a shout out to Matt McManus, who did an episode on the rise of liberal socialism in the 19th and early 20th century. A lot
Hmm.
of this stuff that is in community wealth building today is stuff along with like the cooperative movement is a part of that, right? This is stuff that's been building for a couple hundred years, and now we're finding new resources and twists to make
Hmm.
it launch in an advanced capacity from what it has in the past. And Gar Alperovitz is kind of the middle of an hourglass between the stuff that's coming out of the 19th, early mid 20th century and the practices of community wealth building today. And he sort of channels that in, and then what flows out of him comes into these practices today. And he was talking about exactly this. Um, the pluralist Commonwealth, first off, said we need to have larger roles for local control and for community ownership to be able to bring people in who are not conventional workers and be able to bring the community into the decision making process so that we don't get just something monolithic like market socialism that can produce wonderful things but also problematic things at the same time.
Hmm.
And also because of the great diversity of culture, geography, and economy across a country like the United States. And he was particularly thinking about how could the United States move beyond corporate capitalism. And he said
Hmm.
something monolithic like central planning or unbridled market socialism is probably not going to work uh, politically as well as fully functionally in a country as dynamic and diverse as the United States. So we have to start with forms of local ownership that bring more decision making closer to home and incorporate people who are not just trying to make the most successful business possible. But then we have to have a role for those companies that are that have some of those elements to them, but it can't be something that then takes over the economy. So we have to have these multiple forms of ownership: public ownership, community ownership, as well as worker ownership, and things like consumer cooperatives and whatnot. This plural form of ownership is a part of how we address the shortcomings of something just market socialism. But worker-owned companies and worker cooperatives certainly improve things enormously. They still leave gaps, and we do have methods of solving some of those gaps. And those kinds of institutions already exist. They don't have to be built up from scratch, but we do absolutely need to be intentional about having them, or else those gaps will pop up again.
Hmm. You make a good point. Let's see. Let's get our next comment here. You don't have efficiency of scale in production, though. What do
Hmm.
you think of that?
In terms of I would love some more
In
specifics
terms
about.
of comparison, in terms of comparison to larger corporations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can't have large scale. It isn't that we can't have large scale enterprise.
Hmm.
And there are, I think, 15 worker-owned businesses, majority worker-owned businesses in America that have over 10,000 workers. And of course, Mondragon shows that you can go to a very large scale. They're an industrial behemoth. So we can have large-scale enterprise, and sometimes when we get to those larger scales, when it is necessary to have larger scale, it kind of harkens back to a question that was asked earlier. Sometimes we do need to talk about, especially if it's, say, a natural monopoly, then we might need to talk about it not being worker ownership, but being public. Sometimes that means we need to step in and talk about good old-fashioned nationalization. And there is a role for that as well, as I sort of mentioned earlier. We're not taking that off the table.
Mm-hmm. This person says there's a great series about community wealth building by pioneers, hosted by Laura Flanders, exploring Scotland, Preston, Mondragon, and some U.S. efforts. You know about this?
Fantastic. Yeah, I knew that was in development. I hadn't seen the whole series. I'd seen some of Laura Flanders' earlier coverage. She was actually on it from the get-go. She was one of the first people to really be covering community wealth building, and she does a fantastic job. We certainly owe a lot of coverage of the left wing. Certainly owes a great debt of gratitude for the work that Laura Flanders has been doing. She's a powerhouse for sure.
She's amazing.
She also is her partner is the most terrifying dance choreographer in the world.
Oh,
Anybody looks up Elizabeth Streb and looks up the work that Elizabeth Streb does, it will scare the shit out of you, but it is amazing. So I encourage people to look that up as well.
Good to know. We're coming to a close here, but I do have this comment. Best case scenario of something like this is Yugoslavia after 1956. Some impressive elements, but A, required a revolution to implement, B, showcased some inherent contradictions of market socialism.
That may have been hearkening back to the previous question about market socialism a bit. So I'm not sure if that's in reference to what I was saying or in reference to the previous question. But yeah, the Yugoslavian model, yeah, it had it worked better than a lot of other models, but also had a lot of shortcomings. And that's why I think that stuff that has grown in this, we're very fortunate right now in that community wealth building has, as Pascal was saying, we did go out and build up those proof of concepts from the ground up that is justifying expansion at the larger level now. And I think that is a beacon of hope that we have developed these things from the ground up with some very, very impressive examples that show a lot of room for replication and a lot of room for variation on a theme to be spread to many, many communities, and for the ability to provide resources for them to be able to do that in every locality across really any country. But that's very, very different from the way that it was set up in Yugoslavia. You're completely right. And there were yes, that was a system that had probably a limited lifespan. Lots of things to learn from it, but we have to advance upon it. For sure.
Well, I hope now that people will start looking out for more examples of community wealth building and sort of connect more of the dots and recognize more of the examples out there. One more comment from our friend from Cleveland. This is a general statement. The left needs better salespeople.
Yeah. Am I not a good enough salesperson?
You're good. You're good.
Oh, okay.
You're definitely good. No, I think that's a general statement. Especially since we've got this comment. I'll vote for this guy. Are you looking to run for office in your future?
I'm not looking to run for office, no. But I am organizing to try and get more candidates. I've done a fair deal of this work in Canada before of getting political candidates to stand up for policies that are good for community wealth building. We'll see what I can do with the coming election. I kind of alluded to it. Canada's a little bit fucked right now, but we'll see what can happen. I'll do the best I can.
So you're staying in academia?
I'm staying in academia. Yeah. No, I'm working on a lot of projects on the ground floor. There's a lot of interesting things happening with community land trusts in particular in Canada, the community land trust movement, and community bonds, getting people to, including institutions now, to purchase community bonds to build community land trusts. I think we need to look at how community land trusts can do more than, it's important to address housing, but can do more than address housing. Community land trusts can also be a place to provide more affordable access, to start worker cooperatives. And I think we need to start bringing some of those other elements of community wealth building and connecting them in all of our efforts. And that's probably the best chance that we have for progress in Canada right now. Unfortunately, I'm going to keep pushing to get some government supports, but I'm not optimistic.
Well, we appreciate that. This person, Dr. Claw, is from Cleveland. And they say, Colin was cooking tonight, to be honest.
Thank you much. Thank you.
And the person says, Colin is a bad mother.
No one's ever called me that before, but I'll take it.
And just in case you change your mind about running for office, they say, run, Colin, run.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you talking to us about this.
Pleasure.
Pascal?
Well, thank you for sharing another evening of This is Revolution podcast with us. Come see Jason again Thursday night. He may be on tomorrow night if he has any special programming. Colin, thank you for coming on. I appreciate your presence. I got to thank my producer du jour and the voice of reason, M. Toussaint, and all of us at Revolution join us in saying we are
out.